Have you ever noticed the strange contradiction between what you say you want and what actually ignites desire within you? That peculiar disconnect where your conscious mind seeks kindness, stability, and respect, yet your body remains unmoved by the very qualities you claim to value. You find yourself inexplicably bored by genuine affection, mysteriously disinterested in reliable attention, strangely unmotivated by someone who puts your needs first. Society tells you this is immaturity, self-sabotage, or psychological damage. But the answer lies somewhere deeper, somewhere more primal, something that challenges everything we thought we understood about conscious desire. Because when nice guys leave you cold despite your stated preferences, you aren't experiencing a character flaw. You're witnessing the vast divide between your conscious ideals and your unconscious desires. And that recognition doesn't come with comfortable reassurance or simple explanations. It comes with a profound confrontation with the divided nature of the human psyche, a psychological truth that most people spend their entire lives denying. No, you're not broken. You're human. You're not ungrateful. You've simply encountered one of Freud's most fundamental insights, that our conscious minds and unconscious desires often operate on entirely different principles. There's something profoundly revealing about this contradiction between what we think we should want and what actually stirs desire within us, because that dissonance shatters our illusion of psychological unity, dismantles our belief in rational choice, and reveals a brutal truth. Most attraction operates outside conscious control, and most of us are still learning to recognize ourselves in that silent yet deafening mirror of unconscious desire. Freud recognized that civilization requires the suppression of our most primal instincts, creating what he called the division between the pleasure principle and reality principle. And this mysterious aversion to nice guys is actually a manifestation of what he called the return of the repressed. It's what many experience but few have the courage to acknowledge. They don't examine the contradiction between their stated values and their actual desires. They simply deny it exists. They don't question why kindness fails to ignite passion, while challenge somehow does. They're less interested in psychological truth and more in maintaining a coherent self-image. And that makes relationships treacherous, because while we consciously claim to want goodness, our unconscious has discovered the intoxicating power of entirely different qualities. The person who finds themselves unmoved by nice guys isn't simply immature. They're operating from a divided psyche, a structure where conscious values and unconscious desires follow completely different rules, where rational preferences and embodied responses speak entirely different languages. And maybe that's why it creates so much confusion, so much self-doubt, so many attempts to force attraction where none naturally exists. But what many still don't understand is that behind their seemingly contradictory responses is a psyche working exactly as Freud described, split between civilized ideals and primal desires that operate largely beyond conscious control. You don't consciously choose to be turned off by kindness. Your unconscious responds according to its own logic. And until you recognize that division, you exist in a state of psychological contradiction, mistaking conscious values for the actual drivers of desire. Maybe you don't recognize yourself in this right now. Maybe you think it's cynical, reductive, or an oversimplification of your complex emotional life. But deep down, way deep down, there's a question inside you. A quiet one that pulses even when you try to ignore it. What if what you consciously claim to want and what actually awakens desire within you are governed by entirely different psychological systems? The mysterious absence of attraction to nice guys is not a character defect. It's structure. And those who don't understand Freud's concept of the divided psyche often mistake psychological inevitability for moral failure throughout their entire lives. But what few people see is that we don't create this contradiction consciously. It emerges from the very structure of the psyche itself, where civilization's demands and our primal needs exist in perpetual tension. Freud believed that desire operates largely outside conscious control, following rules established not by our rational mind, but by unconscious associations, infantile experiences, and primal instincts. And maybe that's why so many still find themselves unmoved by the very qualities they sincerely believe they should want, while being inexplicably drawn to dynamics that their conscious mind would never deliberately choose. While most people claim their relationship choices are based on conscious values, the unconscious knows the difference between ideals and desires. And there, in the midst of what we call rational choice, they've encountered not preference, but programming. Early experiences when the neurochemistry of attraction was first being established, when their psyche encountered the complex interplay of pursuit and resistance, attachment and independence that forever altered their understanding of what triggers desire. Their contradictory response to nice guys didn't develop from rational consideration, but was established in formative moments when the very architecture of desire itself was being created. This person knows moments of genuine alignment. They've experienced it. They've had relationships where, briefly at least, their conscious values and unconscious responses seem to operate in harmony. But somehow, those moments of integration remain elusive, repeatedly giving way to the familiar pattern where kindness fails to sustain interest, while challenge somehow keeps desire alive. And that pattern wasn't created randomly. It reflects the fundamental division Freud identified between what civilization teaches us to value and what our unconscious actually responds to. What registered in their psychological development wasn't just the conscious message about what they should want, but the unconscious imprinting of what actually triggered desire. What emerged wasn't integration, but division. And that division becomes psychologically destabilizing because it combines the moral certainty of conscious values with the undeniable reality of embodied responses that follow entirely different rules. They don't want to reject kindness. They want to desire what they consciously value. They're no longer choosing partners based solely on stated preferences, but on the mysterious alchemy of what actually awakens desire. So maybe that's why their relationship history feels so contradictory to many observers, because it's not about conscious choice, but unconscious response. And that takes more than intellectual understanding to truly integrate. It takes recognition of the divided nature of the psyche itself, where few are willing to acknowledge that their unconscious desires may bear little resemblance to their conscious ideals. And that's where many relationships founder. Not because values change, but because the initial attempt to override unconscious responses with conscious preferences eventually surrenders to the undeniable reality of what actually sustains desire. They don't want to merely rationalize, they want to understand. Until then, they experience this contradiction not by conscious choice, but out of psychological structures they didn't create, but inherited from both evolutionary history and personal development. This person isn't shallow, they're divided. There's a vast difference between deliberate rejection of kindness and the unconscious failure of kindness to trigger desire. But the world doesn't easily accept the complexity of this division. A world that still moralizes desire. A world that still believes conscious preferences should dictate unconscious responses, as if the divided nature of the psyche were a moral failing rather than a fundamental condition. Freud once said that much of civilization rests upon the renunciation of instinct. But perhaps our greatest confusion comes not from the existence of this division, but from denying it. And this person's contradictory responses don't operate by conscious deception. They follow the psyche's inherent structure. They hear phrases like, "You should want someone who treats you well. What's wrong with you that kindness turns you off? You need therapy if you can't appreciate a nice guy." And inwardly they understand the logic but feel powerless against the reality of their own responses. Because they sense what many don't realize, that what we consciously claim to want and what actually triggers desire are often operating on entirely different psychological frequencies. They're not looking for mistreatment. They're experiencing the uncomfortable truth that desire often follows rules established not by conscious values, but by unconscious associations. Someone who triggers not what they think they should want, but what actually awakens response on a bodily level. And let's be honest, that's not something you consciously choose, but unconsciously experience. The absence of attraction they feel isn't a deliberate rejection of kindness, but the natural outcome of a psyche where conscious ideals and unconscious desires operate according to different principles. They're living proof that the reality principle and pleasure principle often exist in tension rather than harmony, and that disrupts our cultural narratives. Moral choice feels illusory. Conscious preference seems decorative rather than determinative, but they aren't deliberately choosing this contradiction. They're responding to a psychological division that exists not by choice, but by structure. And the confusion they feel when kindness fails to ignite what challenge somehow does is by itself a brutal indicator of how deeply divided the human psyche actually is. This person isn't morally deficient by nature. They don't deliberately reject goodness. They understand intellectually the appeal of kindness and stability, and for that they carry a double burden, both the reality of what actually triggers their desire and the intellectual awareness that it contradicts what they sincerely believe they should want. They value goodness while their unconscious responds to challenge. They appreciate kindness while psychological conditioning pulls them toward dynamics that include elements of pursuit and uncertainty. They long for relationships that align with their conscious values, while their attractions reliably follow patterns their rational mind would never choose. And when they meet someone genuinely kind, it's not rejection they feel, it's absence. The absence of the psychological triggers their unconscious has been programmed to respond to. When they find themselves inexplicably bored by someone who meets their stated criteria, it's not ingratitude, it's structure. The structure of a psyche where conscious preferences and unconscious responses follow different rules. When they try to force attraction where the body feels none, it's not moral striving, it's psychological contradiction. And that internal battle between conscious values and unconscious responses is their greatest struggle. Because they don't consciously choose to be unmoved by kindness. They're driven by psychological systems largely operating beyond awareness. And that divided self between what they aspire to want and what actually triggers response is what makes their contradictions so difficult to resolve through conscious intention alone. Perhaps what unsettles people most about this pattern isn't its irrationality. It's the uncomfortable truth it reveals about the nature of human desire itself. Freud taught that civilization requires the renunciation of instinct. But what happens when that renunciation creates not integration, but division? It was precisely that question that exposes why genuine kindness often fails to sustain desire for those whose psyche operates exactly as Freud described, divided between conscious ideals and unconscious responses. It wasn't by choice, it was a psychological reality that emerged from both our evolutionary history, where certain dynamics triggered mating responses, and our personal development, where the very neurochemistry of desire was being established through specific early experiences. They no longer experience relationships through moral illusions alone. They're beginning to glimpse psychological reality. And that changes everything. How many times have you wondered why you intellectually appreciate someone yet feel no spark? How many times have you felt guilty for being unmoved by genuine kindness? This person has felt that too. They once thought there must be something fundamentally wrong with them for not desiring what they consciously value. But one day, they began to question whether what they were experiencing was moral failure or psychological inevitability. And that day, they made the first step toward recognizing a division that had been invisible, yet controlling their emotional life completely. Their path toward integration is not a straight line. There are days of insight, moments of painful recognition, nights of wondering why they can't simply desire what they consciously choose. But there's also a growing clarity that illuminates what was once completely confusing. They learned that what they call desire often has very little to do with conscious preference at all. The mysterious absence of attraction to nice guys is not pathology, but structure. The contradictions they experience are not character flaws, but expressions of a psyche that operates exactly as Freud described. divided between civilization's demands and more primal responses. And until that fundamental division is recognized, they choose to begin acknowledging rather than simply denying their own psychological reality. Not out of moral surrender, but out of the necessity for psychological honesty. This person is the living embodiment of Freud's insight that the human psyche is fundamentally divided. They've been shaped by both conscious socialization about what they should want and unconscious imprinting about what actually triggers desire, formed by a psychological structure that permanently established a division between stated values and embodied responses, pulled by systems so different that they create the perpetual experience of contradiction. And now that they're beginning to recognize the pattern, they face the monumental task of accepting rather than denying the divided nature of desire itself. They don't want just to pretend alignment where division exists. They want to understand how it shapes what they experience as attraction. That's challenging because it requires not just intellectual understanding but psychological honesty. And sadly, few undertake this difficult journey. Most still mistake the divided psyche for moral failure, psychological confusion for character flaw, structural inevitability for deliberate choice. And if they still find themselves unmoved by nice guys today, it's because every instance reflects the fundamental division Freud identified. Every experience of attraction they feel is governed not by conscious preference alone, but by unconscious systems operating according to entirely different principles. Every relationship they enter reveals the tension between what they think they should want and what actually awakens desire. They're beginning to see the pattern without yet knowing how to integrate it. And that awareness born from honest self-observation transforms their relationship to desire itself. Because a person who has glimpsed the divided nature of their own psyche becomes psychologically awakened, not because the division immediately resolves, but because they've begun to see what was previously denied. The person who finds themselves inexplicably turned off by nice guys is not making a moral error. Something inside them is structured exactly as Freud described, and it was precisely that structure that created both their contradictory responses and the potential for their eventual integration. Because sometimes only in recognizing division can we begin the long process of genuine acceptance. Freud suggested that making the unconscious conscious doesn't eliminate the division, but makes it bearable through understanding. And that's exactly what they've begun to undertake. They're reconnecting with how desire actually operates, facing the reality of how profoundly the psyche is divided between conscious ideals and unconscious responses, patterns that weren't chosen but emerged from the very structure of psychological development itself. They disrupted unconscious contradiction by making it conscious. They began questioning what they thought was a character flaw, not by becoming morally lax, but by becoming psychologically honest. They learned that their response to nice guys wasn't a deliberate rejection of goodness, but a natural expression of how desire actually operates, largely outside conscious control. And when they stopped simply moralizing their own responses, they began the more nuanced work of truly seeing the pattern clearly, first with guilt, then with recognition, and finally with the acceptance necessary for any genuine integration, because someone who has seen the divided nature of their own psyche no longer mistakes psychological structure for moral failing quite so readily. They learn to notice the division between their conscious values and unconscious responses, to honor the reality of their psyche while not being completely controlled by it. They're not instantly transformed. They simply no longer act completely unconsciously. There's a world of difference between blind confusion and division observed with growing clarity. They still feel the contradiction between what they think they should want and what actually triggers desire, yes, but they've begun to recognize it as structure rather than pathology. Not with self-judgment or harsh criticism, but with the curious attention of someone who genuinely wants to understand, rather than simply continue fighting their own psychological reality. Their awareness has become an ally rather than an enemy. Their recognition is a new capacity. they can begin to distinguish between moral ideals and psychological responses, and they don't hesitate to question what once seemed like evidence of their own moral failing. Their transformation isn't immediate. It's gradual. It's as if they've tapped into an ancient understanding, an old wisdom that humans aren't destined to perpetually mistake psychological division for character flaw, but can, through awareness, begin to accept rather than deny the complex nature of desire, not to surrender moral aspiration, but to recognize its complex relationship with unconscious response. And in accessing that understanding, something awakens in them, a psychological honesty, emotional maturity, a person who, though still divided in the way Freud described, is no longer completely confused by it. They're in communion with something greater, with the possibility of integration through acceptance rather than denial. And no matter how deeply established the division between conscious values and unconscious desires, nothing remains completely confusing when illuminated by genuine self-awareness. They no longer simply moralize their own responses. They observe them with growing clarity. They're no longer helplessly confused by the contradiction between what they think they should want and what actually awakens desire. They do the psychological work. And that shift from unconscious confusion to conscious recognition changes everything about their relationship to kindness and attraction. But they're no longer identified completely with either their conscious ideals or their unconscious responses. They've already begun to see beyond simplistic narratives, and in that seeing, they discovered that integration might look completely different from what they imagined. Not the subordination of unconscious desire to conscious preference, but the honest recognition of both. There's something profound about the way they now approach their responses. They don't need to deny the divided nature of the psyche. Their awareness is expanding, and it's in that expansion that their true freedom lives. Freud said that where repression was, there consciousness shall be. And perhaps that's why this person, in choosing to understand, rather than simply deny, has become someone capable of eventually finding greater integration between conscious values and unconscious responses. They no longer try to simply force themselves to desire what leaves them cold or convince anyone that they should feel what they don't. They don't deny the reality of the division because they've learned that psychological patterns clarify not through moralization, but through recognition. And when they feel that familiar absence of attraction to genuine kindness, they now pause. They don't engage in self-recrimination or performative appreciation. They observe with the dignity of someone who's experienced this contradiction enough times to recognize its inevitability. What few people understand is that this person still values goodness. They still appreciate kindness, generosity, and respect. But they want to understand why these qualities alone fail to ignite what other, often less conscious dynamics somehow do. They want this understanding not to abandon their values, but to move toward greater integration between what they consciously choose and what unconsciously moves them. Now they only offer themselves where there's the possibility for both value alignment and genuine desire. And that requires a level of maturity that goes far beyond conventional romance. It requires self-awareness. It requires having faced one's own psychological contradictions and still choosing to evolve beyond simple narratives. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for integration, a connection where there's both alignment with conscious values and activation of unconscious desire, where both can relate to each other through the whole psyche rather than just its conscious or unconscious aspects in isolation. And if that seems more complex than the moral simplicity they've known, perhaps that's precisely the point. Because they'd rather find genuine integration than continue mistaking psychological division for moral failing. And to many still caught in that confusion, that sounds like moral surrender. But it's really just psychological honesty in its purest form. If something inside you was touched by this exploration, maybe it's because deep down, you too are ready to examine the division between your conscious values and unconscious desires. A contradiction that begins with honoring the divided nature of the psyche itself. A relationship with yourself that acknowledges both your conscious ideals and your unconscious responses without reducing either to the other. A clarity that can't be achieved through moralization alone, but must emerge from increasing psychological honesty. And if that clarity hasn't fully arrived yet, maybe it's because you first needed to recognize that what feels like a character flaw might actually be the very structure of the psyche that Freud identified. Something worth understanding rather than simply judging. And if this message found you at the right moment, or awakened something you forgot was living inside you, then share it with others who might be silently struggling with the same contradictions between what they think they should want and what actually awakens desire within them. Because when something illuminates the soul, the least we can do is let it keep shining within us and through us.